Alrighty, everybody, so what we need to understand is that this year we are likely going to be in what we call a La Niña. I'm sure you've probably heard that before. You probably heard the term El Niño, La Niña. This season, as we are getting ready to see, looks like we are going to be into La Niña characteristics. Now, currently, if we take a look at the sea surface temperature anomalies, you notice out there by the equator here in the Pacific, there's a lot of blue. That is showing that the sea surface temperature, so the surface of the water, is cooler than normal. That typically brings some heavy snow for some places along the country. We're going to get into the overall forecast here in a little bit, guys. You guys are going to want to stay tuned for that because, like I mentioned, some areas really have a solid shot this year. Okay, so like I mentioned, we are likely going to be in a La Niña this season. We can take a look at the graphs here for the forecast, and you notice these letters down here. Now, DJF, this is the main one we need to look at because this stands for December, January, and February, which is like the heart months of winter. If you look at the blue graph here, this goes up to right around 55%, which would lead us to a La Niña. But you notice here that if we take a look at DJF as well, you notice how there's also a pretty decent chance, maybe, of neutral conditions being a possibility. Now, we're likely going to be in a La Niña as we're going to look at more into the depth of the models, but there is also a chance that part of the winter could be in neutral status. We'll talk about that here in a second. Okay, so here is the models regarding this season in terms of, are we going to be in a La Niña, are we going to be in an El Niño, or neutral? I'm going to tell you now, we're not going to be in an El Niño. None of the models do support that, as you can see on the graph here. Now, something I really want to point out for you guys. So if you look at the numbers here, you might notice how there's dotted lines around 0.5 and negative 0.5. So this is neutral conditions. So this would be, neutral conditions we talked about. Up here would be El Niño. And you can see none of the models really go up into El Niño. So we're not going to be in that condition this winter. So typical El Niño patterns, we're not expecting that this year. Then you have La Niña, which is in the negatives. Now, if we take a look at the averages here, we can take a look at the dynamic average here in this kind of red shaded color. And you notice how it goes below that that negative 0.5 line, which would bring us down into weak La Niña conditions. Like we mentioned, we are likely going to be in a La Niña this year. The majority of the models do support that overall. Okay, guys, so things are getting ready to get exciting as we're getting ready to finally push into the official forecast. But there is two things I want to go ahead and show you guys real quick. So this has about a 40% chance of happening. As we did see on that first chart that we were looking at, this is a neutral condition pattern. The majority of the models as we looked at showed La Niña, but there is a possibility that neutral conditions could persist for portions of the winter. Now, if we were going to be in that neutral state, there would likely be a lot more precipitation for the south, a bit more warmer, potentially more storms down there, if we were in that 40% chance neutral state overall. This is still going to potentially bring down a lot of cold air. That's going to be a big thing this winter, I believe, guys, is we are going to have a lot of cold air. Good potential for polar vortexes. We'll get into that here in a minute. But, a lot of cold air would be observed here with a neutral status. Now, we do have the subtropical jet, like I mentioned, would bring in a good amount of moisture for portions of the south, keep it relatively warm while the north stays pretty cold overall. So then we have a La Niña winter, which this has about a 55% chance of persisting through the winter. And as you can see, first of all, that's relatively similar, is a lot of cold air coming down into the country. So you guys are going to see here in a minute, like I mentioned, there is going to be a really good shot for some cold air to work its way down in the country. And the reason is because typically during a La Niña, we got this high pressure here in the eastern Pacific, which kind of, arcs the jet stream overall and kind of pushes more cooler air from up north down into the country. And this can bring more storms, more precipitation for some areas. As you can see here during La Niña, it typically does get pretty wet up there in the Pacific Northwest. Could be a lot of slushy snow. Upper elevations could see a good amount of snow out there, while it just stay pretty dry across the south as there is no subtropical jet. So then, for the east, this actually does cause there to be more precipitation across the Ohio Valley here, typically more warm and dry for the south. But for the Ohio Valley, this could bring some slushy snow, some good clippers, and, overall some good storms here. But let's go ahead and dive on into the official forecast, my friends. We got those graphics ready to roll. We got ourselves an interesting winter up ahead. Alrighty, guys, I am so happy to introduce you guys the NWW116 2025 winter forecast. Here is the official graphics that I have put together for you guys. Okay, so we're going to go ahead and start off here with the overall temperature outlook. Now, this is what we can expect here regarding temperatures for this winter. Now, the first shade here represents a lot of warm air. We are going to likely see some pretty warm conditions this year down here towards the south. You know, we do have that blocking high pressure ridge we were just talking about there, you know, that typically is a thing for La Niña in the eastern Pacific. That will keep portions of the south relatively warm. We do have a second shade of warmth. Now, these areas are likely going to be pretty warm. We're probably going to stay warm due to portions of the Gulf here. You know, a lot of warm air could, you know, persist through portions of the winter. I honestly think that there might be some severe thunderstorm potential this winter towards areas like Louisiana and Texas. This is where I do think we could have some severe weather setups. You know, it's going to be relatively far and deep into the south. But with that being said, we are expecting much cooler than average temperatures to occur across a lot of the north. Like we mentioned there, with that altered jet stream and that cold air coming down from the north, this will keep things pretty darn chilly across the northern country. Across the Pacific Northwest, the northern plains, portions of the upper Midwest will be pretty chilly. And then, of course, we have a second shade where it's going to be much cooler across portions here of the north. Now, this is where I do think we potentially could have some really chilly conditions here. Like I mentioned beforehand, I think we might be able to have the potential for some polar vortexes. La Niñas typically can bring some pretty nasty polar vortex activity, and if that's the case, it would be right around in that region there up in the north. So expect a very, very cold winter for those areas. Okay, so now we're moving on into the precipitation side of things. Who's going to see a lot of rain? Who's going to see a lot of snow? Who's going to see not much precipitation at all? So, first off, we're going to start with the areas that are relatively dry. Now, like I mentioned, we're going to have that ridge here in the eastern Pacific, which is going to keep a lot of precipitation away from the Pacific Southwest. We're not really going to see a whole lot of activity. It's going to be relatively dry just really across a lot of the south this year. So, you know, honestly, I really wouldn't expect to see much snowfall for those areas in the deep south. I'm sorry for my folks who live out there, but honestly, this year is probably not going to be your year. But with that being said, we do have ourselves, like I said, another area here for much drier conditions. And that's because of that ridge I was telling you guys about. That's going to really prohibit a lot of precipitation from reaching this region, keeping things bone dry. But now, my friends, we roll our way into the above average precipitation areas. Now, we actually have two areas here. The Pacific Northwest gets completely battered with a lot of rainfall. A lot of those upper elevations will see a good amount of snowfall too. And you notice the Ohio Valley is really in the region here where we could see a lot of precipitation. We got the cold jet stream bringing down a lot of cold air, sometimes bringing in some moisture, keeping the Pacific Northwest pretty saturated for the most part. And this also allows for some storm systems to roll up throughout the portions of the Ohio Valley, keeping things relatively wet, which could, and if all conditions are right, meet the standards for some pretty good snowstorms. And with that being said, we do have a second shade for the precipitation. Now, these areas here, both regions, we are expecting much above average precipitation. So across the regions here, there's going to be a lot of rain, possibly a lot of snow for these areas here. So keep that in mind, as these areas here might have a good shot at seeing a good amount of snow. Alrighty, guys, here is the final graphic overall. We're going to go ahead and jump right on into the overall forecast for this year. Who's going to see the snow? Who's not? What are we looking like for all areas of the country coming right up. Alrighty, guys, so before we go ahead and get on into the final verdict of what we can expect for the 2025 winter season, once again, guys, if you guys could do me a huge favor, consider leaving a like, subscribing, and most importantly, sharing this with your friends and family. Like I said, this took me a long time to make with the graphics, the editing, the recording, so if you guys could show me a little bit of love with that, it would be much appreciated. But alright, my friends, let's waste no more time and go ahead and get on into it. So we're going to start off here with the Rockies. Now, we are expecting some decent snow. Like I was mentioning before, we're going to get that jet stream kind of really piling up from the north. That's going to be bringing down a bit of cooler air for some of those upper elevations, as well as, I think, some pretty decent upper level snowfalls. So I would expect a good amount of snowfall for some of those upper elevations out there. Now, moving down into the south, out there towards, Texas, Louisiana, it's going to be relatively dry and warm. We're just going to go ahead and get that one out of the way. It's going to be a pretty boring season for you guys, more than likely. Now, I will say, like I was mentioning earlier in the video, there might be some chances for maybe, some stray severe thunderstorm events. I think could be possible throughout, like Texas, Louisiana, just, some of the Gulf Coast. I think we could have some type of severe weather events kicking off this winter. So then moving on over here into the north. Now, like I mentioned, a lot of cold air, regardless of whatever it's going to be, La Nina or neutral conditions. Those are going to be the two that we're going to be looking out for this winter. Either or, both of those conditions do support a lot of cold air for the north. And that is going to bring the potential for some polar vortexes, some really, really cold shots of air, and some good setups for some good winter storms across the country. Then next of all, we have the Pacific Northwest, which things are pretty wet. Like I mentioned, we have a lot of precipitation that does tend to get into this region. We have that high pressure ridge out there in the west, which is going to keep the southwest fairly dry and actually allow for the northwest to be fairly wet. So you guys up there towards, Oregon, portions out there by Washington, it's probably going to be a pretty rainy season, pretty wet season out there for you guys. So there will likely be some slushy days, some snowy days, some rainy days, all the above up there for you guys. Now then we move our way into the central U.S. Now I do think we could have some good snows. I think it's going to be probably more towards average for you guys this season. Probably not going to see a whole lot of craziness this year, honestly. But I do think that we will have the potential for some good snow overall. Then we roll our way into the west, the southwest here. We have fairly dry, below average precipitation. Once again, that ridge is going to be the death to the southwest here, not really allowing for much precipitation. Honestly, it's going to be fairly dry, fairly warm across some of those regions there in some places. So honestly, really not expecting a lot for you guys. Now we're getting into some interesting territory. So working our way here towards the Ohio Valley. A lot of my folks live out here. Cool and wet conditions. I think we could have a lot of good snowstorms. Like I mentioned, we're going to have that cold air really coming down into the country from that La Nina, from even the neutral conditions. Regardless, there's going to be a pretty good amount of cooler air rolling into the region here. And I really do think that could set us up for some pretty decent snow events. We could have a lot of clippers, just little snowstorms. We could have full-on blown snowstorms this year. Honestly, I think you guys have a good shot at seeing some good precipitation. I think you guys could see some good snow out there in the Ohio Valley, portions of the Midwest. And then, of course, we have our areas towards the Tennessee Valley and the Mid-Atlantic. Honestly, this is the region where it could be kind of iffy. I think that there could be a lot of mixed precipitation, probably a lot of ice and sleet and freezing rain would be a pretty big concern for some of these regions out here, I think, because we're going to have some of the warmth from the south mixing in with some of the precipitation from the north, and that's going to, create this battle zone where we could have some snowfall, we could have some slushiness. I mean, we could have some snowstorms, of course. Depends, on local conditions and everything like that. But that's the region where I think we could have some mixed precipitation. I think we could have, some overall like ice and some of that kind of concerns overall for those regions. And then, of course, lastly, my friends, we have the New England regions where we do expect a couple of nor'easters. We do have ourselves that jet stream, like I was mentioning, really coming in and dipping down, keeping the pressure relatively low across the Ohio Valley, keeping things, potentially more rainy, more snowstorms and stuff like that. And some of those systems could ride up the northeast coast, keeping things relatively snowy. Now, there is one thing I do want to mention, and you can see how the battle zone does go up across kind of the coastal New England regions. Sometimes that water and being close to the coast keeps the air temperature slightly warmer. And that would allow for the potential of some of the snowstorms to actually turn more into mixed precipitation, if not rain. That's why I included the battle zone for portions of the New England coast. As like I mentioned, that water has a direct impact on, precipitation type and everything like that. But anyways, my friends, well, that's going to go ahead and wrap it up. That's the seasonal forecast here for the 2025 winter season. Let me know what you guys thought in the comments. It'd be greatly appreciated. Once again, thank you guys for being here. Leave a like, hit that subscribe button, and most importantly, share this with your friends and family. Anybody you guys can, it would be much appreciated. All right, everybody, we'll see y'all in the next one. Thanks for joining. Catch ya later on.